Hello and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We just finished talking about the birth of Jesus and all that's connected to that in the last class. And now here in class 11, which also has two parts, we're going to talk about Jesus' childhood. Perhaps you've read some of the stories in the Bible about his birth and his childhood and wondered about the rest of it, because we really have very few stories that are connected to Jesus' childhood in the Bible. And so we look at those and they teach us some things, and then we imagine how other things might have been. And then if we go to some of the background of the prophecy and also the culture and history and geography like we've been doing, we have other clues about what Jesus' childhood and upbringing might have been like. So let's go over to Matthew chapter 2. We just finished reading the last part of that where Joseph and Mary and Jesus have fled to Egypt. And now they've come back and they're looking to find a safe place to live, and they have to avoid the region of Jerusalem. So verse 23 says, "And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth," and that's up in Galilee. "So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, he will be called a Nazarene." Now, when we first read that, we assume a couple of things. First, that there is a prophecy we can go back and look up that says that. And second is that he was called a Nazarene because he was from Nazareth, and maybe that's what people from that town are called. But actually, both those things are mistaken. If you go look for this prophecy as such, it doesn't exist. You can't find it. And then Nazarene actually means something a little bit different, or the way that this phrase is taken means something different than we might have originally thought. Now, if you go on to Isaiah chapter 11, which is one of the references in connected to this last passage. Isaiah 11:1 says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit." So if you connect several ideas here, you know that in the Old Testament, and often really throughout history, Israel as a nation is considered a son of God, or children of God. And it's also compared many times to an olive tree, which is the most prevalent tree in Israel. And so this messianic prophecy talks about how the Messiah will be connected to this idea of being an olive tree. In fact, it says that even though the olive tree may seem dead, just a stump left, that there will be a shoot come up out of it, and that shoot will be a branch and bear fruit, which is the Messiah. And so Jesus fulfills this idea. And let me give you this word here that this space refers to, and then talk about it a little bit more. Jesus is actually the Netzer. That's spelled N-T-Z-E-R. That's actually the Hebrew word. Jesus is the Netzer. Now, if you go on and look a little bit more about the imagery connected to this, you see here an olive tree that's actually in the current town of Nazareth. There's a place called a Living Village in Nazareth, and they've tried to recreate what the childhood town of Nazareth must have looked like in Jesus' time. Not necessarily like the actual street layout and all that, but the kinds of things that would have been in that village. And they try to explain it to you, and they dress in the costumes of that time, and they try to imitate and show the practices that would have been common for people living in that time. Well, if you walk down one of the paths of that village, you see this olive tree. And so naturally you think about this passage, talking about he'll be called a Nazarene, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch will bear fruit. The interesting thing about this is what we know about the olive tree as such. If an olive tree lives for maybe decades or even several centuries, then after a while it gets to the point where it's going to be better for the tree to be cut down. And normally we would think that when you cut down a tree and you have a stump like this, that its life is finished, that now it's not good for anything but maybe to sit on or maybe to dig up and burn for firewood. But the olive tree really never dies. Its roots are deep, and so the next spring, after it's even cut down, then there will be little shoots that start to come up out of it, okay? And if you look at this picture, I actually took a close-up picture of the roots of this olive tree in Nazareth that you saw. And if you look at the stump of this, or the trunk of this tree, you see little olive shoots start to come out of it, and this will become part of the tree as it continues to grow. And so the idea is that even though Israel as a nation was cut off. It looked like they were finished when the 10 northern tribes were taken off into Assyria, and then Judah was taken off into Babylon. It might have looked like they were dead, and the promises were gone, and the covenant was broken. But actually, through the Messiah, through the shoot from the stump of Jesse, there will be this branch that will come forth and begin to bear more fruit, and that's the Messiah. These little shoots that come out of the trunk then are what's called netzers, the word that you wrote down. Now, if you think about that, then you get a picture of what the idea was for the town of Nazareth after the exile, and then maybe the connection to Jesus. It seems that those who returned from the exile in Babylonia began to settle in these northern towns and villages of Galilee, as we've mentioned before. And one of these small towns was Nazareth, or Nazareth in Hebrew. And the interesting thing about this is that they didn't necessarily move to the town of Nazareth. They moved and they established their town, and they wanted to pick a name for the town. And this clan, this extended family, believed that they were the ones through whom the Messiah, the Netzer, was going to come. And so they, in a sense, they called themselves the town of Netzer, because it was the town that the shoot from the stump of Jesse would come from. And so it wasn't that Jesus was named for the town of Nazareth. It was more that the town of Nazareth was named for Jesus, because it was talking about the Netzer, the one who would come from this town. And so in that sense, Jesus is called a Nazarene. He's the reason for the town name of Nazareth. He is the Netzer that will provide hope and for the covenant to continue on and for a new life to grow from that stump that the Israelites thought was cut off forever. So an interesting switch around there with the name of Nazareth, even the name of the place where he's born. Now, today, Nazareth looks like this. It's a town of around 100,000, give or take a little bit. It's actually one of the towns that has a larger number of Christians relatively in Israel. This town and Bethlehem, I think, are the two largest populations of Christians. But even so, neither one of the two is predominantly Christian. Nazareth is largely Arab, and some are Muslims, some are Arab Jews. Interesting combinations there. And so this is what it looks like if you went this day. One of the most famous places in Nazareth today is the Church of the Annunciation. We've seen this briefly before. This is where they built the church, remembering when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and announced to her that she would be the mother of Jesus. And this is probably one of the most famous parts of the church, the door. And on this door, if you look, it has different scenes from the life of Jesus. A very interesting piece of artwork, the door there. And then if you go to the village that I mentioned earlier, it's a part of Nazareth today. And it's this village recreated to help you learn and understand about Nazareth in the time of Jesus. So this is one of the rooms in a house that they built as a typical house. And this is the carpentry shop. And we'll talk a little bit more about Joseph being a carpenter and Jesus as well later on. Our understanding of that may be incomplete. But this is just a typical shop, and you see a lot of the implements or the tools that a carpenter or a builder might use back in those days. Then if you walk on through the house, you see another little bench here, and on the bench you have a bowl full of balls of yarn. And actually these balls were actually woven together and rolled up by this lady that's standing in the middle of the picture with the turban on. She's working on an old loom, and she showed us how that she wove those strands together to become the yarn, and then the yarn to make other things as well. Then the lady on the left is our tour guide through the house. So if you get a little bit closer look, you see the different colors that she has there, that she's made the yarn, she's dyed those balls, those different colors. And these are natural colors to the region. In other words, they tried to make it as authentic as they could, even down to the kinds of plants they would use to get dye, to dye the yarn. Then if you go on around the village, you run into the man who's leading the donkey here on the threshing floor or threshing field. You see the donkey is pulling a sledge behind it that has little teeth on the bottom of it, and the teeth help grind up the grain, and then as they take the grain and throw it into the air, or at least all the the chaff and the grain together, the grain falls back to the ground and then the chaff blows away. And that's the whole idea of the threshing floor and separating the chaff and the wheat. Then you walk a little further and you come to what was the wine press of the time. And they think that actually, according to the archaeology, this could have actually been the wine press during the time of Jesus, because the age is about right. And there's not too many of these over the years. Nazareth for centuries was just a small little village. And so they think this could have been the original wine press. And they have different examples of the jars in which they would put the juice or the wine as it would come out while they were making wine. Then if you walk a little bit further, you see the synagogue, and you go inside. And of course, part of the core of the synagogue is the law. And this is a sample of a scroll. This is obviously not an original scroll, but they tried to make it look as much as they could like it. You have the scrolls from which you roll, the parchment from one roll to the other. Then you have to the right and the left the little clay lamps in which they put oil and then light them to give light. Then if you look around the synagogue, this is the main hall. And since we've already studied the synagogues, you see this follows the pattern. You have the pillars, the central area, the benches around the edges where people can sit. You have just an example here of the size of it. And this might not have been really too different from the size of the synagogue in the time of Jesus when he was growing up. It could have been about this size, maybe a little larger or smaller. And then you see the windows at the top toward the roof for the air and the light to come in. And then this is the door as you walk out of it. So interesting to at least begin to imagine what it must have been like to be in the Nazareth of Jesus' birth. So we go on to the next story. Go back with me to the New Testament, over to Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. And this is one of the only stories that we have of the entire childhood of Jesus. Verse 41 says, "Every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him." Now let's take a little pause here to explain a little bit about that. According to one of our guides, sometimes as caravans would come and go from Jerusalem, they would separate into men and women. And sometimes the younger children could go with either the men or the women, and then they would meet up during at night when they camped, and the families would come back together. Because I've always wondered, how is it that they let a whole day pass and didn't realize that Jesus was with them? It could have been for this reason, that perhaps when they separated the caravan, the men and the women, and then the children went with either one, perhaps Mary and Joseph thought Jesus was with the other group. That's one of the possible explanations. Verse 46, "After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you.' 'Why were you searching for me?' he asked. 'Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?' But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things up in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man." So we have this key story of Jesus' childhood. Most likely, this is the time when it's his bar mitzvah, when he is growing up, becoming a man in the Jewish sense, when he completed his first stage of education, most likely had memorized the Pentateuch by this time. And one of the parts of that was that he got to go to Jerusalem with the family for Passover and help sacrifice the Passover lamb. And so it's possible that's the trip and the event that this event is connected to. And you can understand his excitement about being in the temple. You can also understand his parents being so worried. 3 days is a long time to look for a child that you've lost. And then also you think about the mother's reaction, Mary's reaction. pretty typical also. You're scared, you're afraid he's dead, and then once you see your child is okay, the scare goes away, and then you get angry. Why did you do this to me? And so it's a pretty typical reaction as well. And then his answer, the Bible says, they didn't really understand. Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Any Jew would consider God his father. And so in a sense, they would have thought, well, yeah, but he's your father, but he's every Jew's father. But they didn't understand, perhaps. He was saying, no, there's a different connection of father-son in this case. And that brings us over to the next idea of when Jesus really began to understand that he was the Son of God. When he began to understand he was divine and human, and how that worked out in his life. When did he begin to be able to do miracles? Were there extra things that he could or couldn't do because he was divine and human? You wonder when he began to realize all of this and how it played out as he was growing up there in Nazareth. And so one of the questions I like to give to people is this question about what's the percentages like in Jesus? Was he 100% divine and not human at all? Most people think, probably not. Was he 100% human and not divine at all? And you'll have more people on that one, but still, some people think it's a mix. Some people think half and half, or maybe 100%, 100%. And I think that if we look at the text and how Jesus acts and speaks, we tend to fall more on this option number 4, that we do believe he was human, totally human, and also totally divine. And that's actually one of the mysteries that have really intrigued and also confused the church for centuries. The nature of Jesus, the combination of divine and human, and what that meant for his life and ministry. So you come back to these questions of when he knew, and then could he do all that he did because he was divine? For example, when he had the temptations that we're going to talk about in a little bit, could he resist the temptation because he was divine, or because he was perhaps human, depending on God? And if you think about it, that's a really important answer, because if he resisted temptation only because he was divine, then we don't have any hope of resisting temptation because we're not divine. However, if he resisted temptation because he was a human who depended on God, and God showed us how humans can resist temptation, then that gives us all the hope in the world. And the same thing would apply to his miracles and perhaps other parts of his ministry. Could he do the miracles that he did because he was divine, and so he used God's power to do that? Or could he do them because he was a human who was trusting God and called on God to help him do those miracles of healing and resurrection and all the rest? And again, the question is crucial, because if he only did miracles because he's divine, then we don't have a hope of doing them. But if you can call on God and God will give you as a human the ability to do miracles, then perhaps things are more open to us than we might have thought. And perhaps that's part of what John 14:12 means when the last night of his life on earth, he tells his apostles there during the Last Supper, all the things that I've been doing, you will also do, and you'll do greater things than these if you ask God in my name. If you think about that, if that's possible for us as humans, depending on God, following Jesus' example, then that's pretty exciting. So I want to leave you with that thought for this first part of the class, thinking about Jesus' childhood and how he came to understand his mission and who he was in his ministry. We'll see you next time to talk about the rest of the ministry or the childhood of Jesus.